The fever had been raging for 3 days when Duke Henry Whitford first realized the terrible truth about his life, that wealth and title meant nothing when death came calling, and that the grand estate he had inherited, the fortune he had accumulated, and the family name he had spent 32 years upholding could not buy him a single moment of genuine human compassion. From his 4-poster bed in the master chamber of Whitford Manor, Henry watched through fever-clouded eyes as his younger brother Charles packed his belongings with unseemly haste, muttering about contagion and necessary precautions, while his eyes gleamed with barely concealed anticipation of an inheritance that might soon be his. His sister Margaret had departed that very morning without so much as a farewell, claiming urgent business in London that everyone knew was nothing more than a convenient excuse to distance herself from a dying man whose will had not yet been changed in her favor. The physicians had pronounced his condition grave, a wasting fever of unknown origin that had already claimed 2 other members of the nobility that season, and had recommended isolation and prayer, though their hasty retreat from his bedside suggested they held little hope for his recovery. The servants, too, had begun to abandon their posts one by one, some claiming fear of infection, others simply disappearing into the night when they realized their wages might not be forthcoming from a dead master. By the 4th day, Whitford Manor, once bustling with activity and filled with the constant presence of family, friends and staff, had become a tomb-like monument to solitude, its vast corridors echoing with nothing but Henry's labored breathing and the occasional creak of ancient timbers. It was then, in the depths of his delirium, that he became aware of a gentle presence that had not fled, a soft voice that spoke words of comfort rather than farewell, and careful hands that tended to his needs with a devotion that had nothing to do with duty or expectation of reward. Through the haze of fever, he glimpsed a young woman with kind eyes and work-worn hands, someone whose face he recognized but whose name he had never bothered to learn, one of the housemaids who had served his family faithfully for years, while remaining as invisible to him as the wallpaper in his grand drawing rooms. Eliza Bennet, 24 years old, and possessed of a quiet strength that had been forged in the fires of hardship and loss, had made a decision that would have seemed incomprehensible to those who knew her humble station. She would not abandon the Duke in his hour of greatest need, not because she owed him anything, but because her conscience would not allow her to turn away from human suffering, regardless of the social chasm that separated them. As Henry drifted in and out of consciousness, burning with fever and abandoned by all who had claimed to love him, he began to understand that this simple maid, this woman he had never truly seen despite her years of service, might be the only person in his entire privileged existence who possessed the kind of loyalty and compassion that could not be bought, inherited, or commanded, but only given, freely from a heart that knew the true meaning of devotion. The fever takes hold. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came during the elaborate dinner party Duke Henry Whitford was hosting for the local magistrates and their wives. He had been discussing the new agricultural reforms with Lord Pemberton when a sudden wave of dizziness nearly sent him tumbling from his chair at the head of the magnificent mahogany table. "With your grace, are you quite well?" asked Lady Pemberton, her voice carrying more curiosity than genuine concern, as she noticed the pallor that had suddenly overtaken their host's usually robust complexion. Henry gripped the edge of the table, forcing a smile that felt like it might crack his face. "Merely tired, I'm sure. The estate business has been particularly demanding of late." But even as he spoke the words, Henry could feel something dark and insidious taking hold within him. His vision seemed to blur at the edges, and a bone-deep chill was settling into his limbs, despite the warmth of the dining room's roaring fire. "Perhaps we should call for Dr. Morrison," suggested his brother Charles, though his tone suggested the idea was more social nicety than genuine worry. "Oh, you do look rather peaked, Henry." "Nonsense," Henry replied firmly, though he had to concentrate to keep his voice steady. "I'm perfectly fine. Please, continue with your meal." The dinner concluded without further incident, though Henry found himself picking at his food and struggling to follow the conversation that flowed around him. By the time the last guest had departed, he was fighting to remain upright, and the short walk from the front door to his private study felt like a journey of miles. "Your Grace," said his butler, a dignified man named Thornton, who had served the Whitford family for over 20 years. "Shall I have someone help you to your chambers?" Henry waved him away with a hand that trembled slightly. "I can manage perfectly well on my own, thank you." But as he climbed the grand staircase to his private apartments, Henry had to stop twice to catch his breath. and by the time he reached his bedroom door, sweat was beading on his forehead, despite the chill that seemed to have settled permanently in his bones. It was then that he saw her, a young woman in the simple brown dress and white apron of a housemaid, carrying fresh linens toward one of the guest chambers. She paused when she noticed his obvious distress, her dark eyes filling with concern. "Your Grace, are you feeling unwell?" she asked, her voice soft but clear. Henry looked at her properly for perhaps the first time, though she had been working in his household for, how long? 3 years. 4. He realized with some shame that he had never bothered to learn her name, though her face was familiar from the countless times she had moved quietly through his home, tending to tasks that kept his life running smoothly. "I'm quite well," he said automatically, though the words came out as little more than a rasp. The maid, Eliza, he thought her name might be, stepped closer, her expression growing more worried. "Begging your pardon, Your Grace, but you don't look well at all. Perhaps I should fetch Dr. Morrison." "That won't be necessary," Henry replied, though even as he spoke, another wave of dizziness washed over him, and he had to steady himself against the doorframe. Without waiting for permission, Eliza set down her linens and moved to his side, offering her arm for support. "Please, Your Grace, let me help you to your room." Henry's first instinct was to refuse. It was highly improper for a servant to touch him, particularly a female servant. But another surge of weakness made the decision for him. He accepted her assistance gratefully, leaning more heavily on her slight frame than he would have thought possible. "Thank you," he murmured, as she helped him into his bedroom and toward the large four-poster bed that dominated the space. "Shall I send for Dr. Morrison now, Your Grace?" Eliza asked as she helped him sit on the edge of the bed. Henry nodded weakly, no longer able to maintain the pretense that nothing was wrong. "Yes, I think that would be wise." By the time Dr. Morrison arrived an hour later, Henry's condition had deteriorated significantly. The chill had given way to a burning fever, and he was alternating between violent shivering and periods where he felt as though he were being consumed by fire from within. "This is most concerning, Doctor," Morrison murmured after his examination, his weathered face grave as he spoke quietly with Charles and Margaret, who had been summoned from their own homes on the estate. "The fever is quite high, and I'm seeing symptoms similar to those exhibited by Lord Ashworth before his recent, unfortunate demise." Henry, though weakened by fever, was still conscious enough to hear the hushed conversation taking place at the foot of his bed. Lord Ashworth had died just 2 weeks prior, succumbing to a wasting fever that had baffled the local physicians. "Or is it contagious?" Margaret asked, and Henry could hear the fear in her voice, though whether it was fear for his welfare or for her own safety, he couldn't be sure. "I cannot say with certainty," Dr. Morrison replied, "but given the similarity of symptoms, I would recommend limiting contact with His Grace to only essential personnel. The household should be informed of the potential risk." Over the next 2 days, Henry watched from his sickbed as his world slowly emptied around him. Margaret was the first to leave, claiming that her young children needed her attention and that she couldn't risk exposing them to whatever illness had taken hold of their uncle. Charles lingered longer, but Henry could see the calculation in his brother's eyes, weighing the risk of contagion against the potential benefits of being present should Henry's condition prove fatal. "I think it would be best if I relocated to the London house for a few weeks," Charles announced on the 3rd day, standing well away from Henry's bed as he spoke. "Just until we know more about your condition. Dr. Morrison agrees that limiting exposure is the wisest course." Henry tried to speak, to protest that he needed his family now more than ever, but the fever had robbed him of strength, and all that emerged was a weak croak. "Don't worry, brother," Charles continued, his tone falsely hearty. "I'll ensure that the estate business is handled properly in your absence. You just focus on getting well." But Henry could see the truth in his brother's eyes. Charles was already thinking of himself as the next Duke of Whitford, already making plans for an inheritance he seemed confident would soon be his. The servants too began to disappear. First the footmen, then the kitchen staff, until only a skeleton crew remained to maintain the vast manor house. Dr. Morrison's visits became less frequent, his treatments more perfunctory, as it became clear that he held little hope for Henry's recovery. By the end of the first week, Whitford Manor had become a place of echoing emptiness, its grand halls silent except for Henry's laboured breathing and the occasional sound of footsteps from the few remaining staff members who hurried through their duties with obvious reluctance. It was during one of his more lucid moments that Henry first became truly aware of the one person who had not abandoned him. Eliza Bennet moved quietly through his room, changing his sweat-soaked bedding with gentle efficiency, bringing him water to sip when his throat felt like sandpaper, and placing cool cloths on his burning forehead with hands that were steady and sure. "You shouldn't be here," Henry managed to whisper during one of her visits. "The others, they've all left because of the risk." Eliza paused in her ministrations, meeting his fever-bright eyes with her own calm brown ones. "I know, Your Grace." "Then why?" Henry's voice trailed off, too weak to complete the question. "Because you need care, Your Grace," Eliza replied simply. "And because it's the right thing to do." The simplicity of her answer struck Henry with unexpected force. Not because she owed him anything, not because she hoped for reward or advancement, but simply because it was right. In his 32 years of life, surrounded by people who wanted something from him, his money, his influence, his name, Henry had never encountered such uncomplicated goodness. "What's your name?" he asked, though he was ashamed that he didn't already know it. "It's Eliza Bennet, Your Grace." "But how long have you worked here, Eliza?" "No, 4 years, Your Grace." "Well, 4 years." This woman had been caring for his home, ensuring his comfort for 4 years, and he had never bothered to learn her name or acknowledge her as anything more than a piece of furniture that happened to move and perform useful tasks. "I'm sorry," Henry whispered, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was apologizing for. His ignorance, his illness, or the fact that she was risking her own health to care for someone who had never shown her the slightest consideration. "There's nothing to be sorry for, Your Grace," Eliza replied gently. "Just rest now. You need to conserve your strength." As Henry drifted back into the fevered haze that had become his constant companion, he found himself thinking about Eliza Bennet, about the quiet courage it must have taken to stay when everyone else had fled, about the compassion that motivated her to risk her own life for his, and about the terrible irony that the only person who had shown him true loyalty was someone he had never bothered to truly see. For the first time in his privileged life, Duke Henry Whitford was learning what it meant to be truly alone, and what it meant to be genuinely cared for by someone who asked for nothing in return. The Vigil. As Henry's fever raged through its second week, the great manor house seemed to hold its breath around them. The few remaining servants moved like ghosts through the corridors, performing only the most essential duties before retreating to the safety of their quarters. Even Mrs. Hartwell, the housekeeper who had served the family for 15 years, had taken to leaving Eliza's instructions on a tray outside the master bedroom door rather than risk entering the sick room herself. Eliza had moved a small cot into the dressing room adjacent to Henry's chamber, allowing her to respond quickly to his needs during the long, difficult nights when the fever seemed determined to claim him entirely. She slept fitfully, waking at every sound, every labored breath, every restless movement, every whispered word that emerged from his delirium. "Mother!" Henry called out during one particularly bad night, his voice hoarse and desperate. "Mother, please don't leave me. I'll be better. I promise I'll be better." Eliza rose quickly from her cot and moved to his bedside, where she found him thrashing weakly against the sweat-soaked sheets, his eyes wide but unseeing as he stared at something only he could perceive. "Shh," she whispered, placing a cool cloth on his burning forehead. "You're safe. You're not alone." "She left," Henry continued, his words slurred with fever. "They all left. Even Charles. Even Margaret. I thought they loved me, but they only loved what I could give them." Eliza's heart clenched at the pain in his voice. Even in his delirium, Henry was grappling with the devastating realization that his family's affection had been conditional, dependent on his health and his ability to provide for them. "A rest now," she murmured, gently smoothing his dark hair back from his fevered brow. "You need to save your strength. Speak. Who are you?" Henry asked suddenly, his fever-bright eyes focusing on her face with startling clarity. "Are you an angel? Have I died?" "And I'm Eliza," she replied softly. "And you're very much alive, Your Grace. You're going to get better." "Eliza," Henry repeated, as if testing the name. "But why are you here? Why haven't you left like the others?" Eliza hesitated, unsure how to explain something she wasn't entirely sure she understood herself. "Because someone needs to take care of you," she said finally. "And because I've seen what it's like to be alone when you're suffering." "Have you?" Henry's voice was barely a whisper. "My mother died when I was 16, Eliza said, settling into the chair beside his bed. She had the lung fever, and it took her slowly. The other servants in the house where we worked were afraid of catching it, so they stayed away. I sat with her every night for 3 weeks, watching her grow weaker and weaker, knowing there was nothing I could do to save her but refusing to let her die alone. Henry stared at her through the haze of fever, struck by the quiet strength in her voice and the compassion that had motivated her to stay by his side despite the risk to herself. "I'm sorry," he managed. "That must have been terrible." "It was," Eliza admitted. "But I learned something important during those 3 weeks. I learned that sometimes the most important thing you can do for another person is simply to be present, to bear witness to their struggle, and to remind them that they matter enough for someone to stay." "Do I matter?" Henry asked, the question emerging from some deep, vulnerable place that the fever had exposed. "Yes," Eliza replied without hesitation. "You matter." The simple declaration seemed to calm something in Henry's fevered mind, and he closed his eyes, his breathing becoming slightly more regular as he drifted back into sleep. As the days passed, Eliza began to see glimpses of the man Henry might have been beneath the aristocratic facade that his position had required him to maintain. In his delirium, he spoke of childhood fears and dreams, of the pressure he had felt to live up to his father's legacy, of the loneliness that had plagued him even when surrounded by crowds of admirers and sycophants. "I wanted to be a scholar," he confessed during one of his more lucid moments. "When I was young, I dreamed of studying at university, of writing books about history and philosophy. But father said that dukes don't waste their time with such frivolous pursuits. But it's not too late," Eliza said gently as she helped him sip some broth. "When you're well again, you could pursue those interests." Henry looked at her with surprise. "You think I'll recover?" "I know you will," Eliza replied with a conviction that surprised them both. "You're stronger than you realize, Your Grace." "Henry," he said quietly. "When we're alone like this, please call me Henry." The request was so far outside the bounds of propriety that Eliza hesitated. "Your Grace, I couldn't—" "Please," Henry interrupted. "I've spent my entire life being Your Grace to everyone around me. I'd like to know what it feels like to simply be Henry to someone." "Very well, Henry," Eliza said, the name feeling strange on her tongue, "but only when we're alone." As Henry's fever began to break during the 3rd week of his illness, their conversations became longer and more meaningful. Eliza found herself sharing stories of her own life, her childhood in a small village, her father's work as a blacksmith, the dreams she had harbored before circumstances forced her into service. "You wanted to be a teacher," Henry observed after she had told him about her love of reading and her desire to help children learn. "It was a foolish dream," Eliza replied, focusing on the embroidery she had brought to occupy her hands during the long hours of watching over him. "Women of my station don't become teachers." "Why not?" Henry asked, his voice growing stronger each day. "You're clearly intelligent and well-read. You have a natural gift for caring for others. Those seem like excellent qualifications for teaching." Eliza looked up from her needlework, surprised by his earnest tone. "Because I'm a servant, Henry. I have no education beyond what I've taught myself, no connections, no means to establish myself in such a position." "Those are obstacles, not impossibilities," Henry replied thoughtfully. "When I'm well again, perhaps we could discuss ways to overcome them." The suggestion was so unexpected that Eliza nearly dropped her embroidery. "You would do that? Help me pursue such a dream?" "Why wouldn't I?" Henry asked, genuine puzzlement in his voice. "You've saved my life, Eliza. You've shown me kindness and loyalty when my own family abandoned me. If I can help you achieve your dreams in return, it would be my honor to do so." Eliza felt tears prick her eyes at his words. In all her years of service, no employer had ever asked about her dreams, much less offered to help her achieve them. The idea that Henry, a duke, a man of immense wealth and influence, would consider using his position to benefit someone like her was almost beyond comprehension. "You're very kind," she whispered. "No," Henry replied, his voice serious. "I'm learning to be human. There's a difference." As Henry's strength slowly returned, Eliza began to see the man he was becoming, or perhaps the man he had always been beneath the expectations and obligations of his position. He was thoughtful, curious about the world beyond his estate, and possessed of a dry sense of humor that emerged as his health improved. "I've been thinking," he said one afternoon, as Eliza helped him sit up in bed to take some solid food for the first time in weeks. "When I'm fully recovered, I want to make some changes to how this estate is run." "What sort of changes?" Eliza asked, settling into what had become her customary chair beside his bed. Better wages for the staff, for one thing. Improved living conditions in the servants' quarters. Perhaps a school for the children of the tenant farmers? Henry paused, then added quietly, I want to be the kind of master who deserves the loyalty you've shown me. And you already are, Eliza said softly. No, Henry replied, shaking his head. I was a man who accepted service without thought, who took loyalty for granted, who never bothered to learn the names of the people who made my comfortable life possible. But I want to be better than that. I want to be worthy of the second chance you've given me. As the 4th week of Henry's illness drew to a close, it became clear that the crisis had passed. His fever had broken completely, his appetite was returning, and his strength was slowly but steadily improving. Dr. Morrison, who had resumed his visits once it became apparent that Henry would survive, pronounced himself amazed by the Duke's recovery. Remarkable, the physician muttered as he completed his examination. I was certain we would lose you, Your Grace. Whatever care you've received has been nothing short of miraculous. Henry's eyes found Eliza, who was quietly tidying his room while the doctor worked. Yes, he said softly, it has been miraculous indeed. As Dr. Morrison departed with promises to return in a few days, Henry realized that his recovery would soon bring an end to the intimate bubble of care and companionship that had sustained him through his darkest hours. Soon, the household would return to normal, the other servants would resume their duties, and Eliza would go back to being just another maid whose name he might or might not remember. The thought filled him with something approaching panic. Eliza, he called as she prepared to leave his room for the evening. Yes, Your Grace? Henry, he corrected gently. And I wanted to say, that is, I wanted you to know. He struggled to find words for the gratitude and affection that had grown in his heart during their weeks together. Thank you for everything. For staying when others left, for caring when you had no obligation to do so, for showing me what true loyalty looks like. Eliza smiled, the expression transforming her entire face. You're welcome, Henry. I'm just glad you're going to be well. As she quietly closed the door behind her, Henry lay back against his pillows and contemplated the future. He was alive thanks to Eliza's care, but more than that, he was changed. The fever had burned away more than just his illness. It had stripped away the assumptions and prejudices that had shaped his understanding of the world. He had learned that worth wasn't determined by birth or wealth, that loyalty couldn't be bought or commanded, and that sometimes the most extraordinary people were hidden in the most ordinary circumstances. Now he faced a choice. He could return to his old life, resume his old patterns, and pretend that nothing had changed. Or he could honor the lessons Eliza had taught him and become the man he now knew he could be. For Henry Whitford, the choice was surprisingly easy to make. The awakening. Henry's first venture outside his bedroom came on a crisp morning in early November, nearly 5 weeks after his illness had begun. Eliza had helped him dress in simple clothes, a white linen shirt and dark trousers that hung loose on his diminished frame, and now supported his arm as he made his way slowly down the grand staircase he had climbed with such difficulty on that first terrible night. The manor house felt different to him now, though he couldn't immediately identify why. As they walked through the main hall, past portraits of his ancestors, and beneath the crystal chandelier that had welcomed countless distinguished guests, Henry realized what had changed. He was seeing his home through different eyes. The servants' quarters are in the east wing, aren't they? He asked Eliza, as they paused to rest in the morning room. Yes, Your Grace, Eliza replied, automatically reverting to formality now that they were in the public areas of the house. I'd like to see them, Henry said. I've lived in this house for 32 years, and I've never once visited the areas where my staff live and work. Eliza looked surprised. Your Grace, I'm not sure that would be... That is, the servants might find it unusual for you to show interest in their welfare, Henry finished. Then it's past time I started doing unusual things. The servants' quarters were a revelation to Henry, and not a pleasant one. The rooms were small and cramped, with thin walls that would provide little warmth during the harsh winter months. The furnishings were sparse and worn, and the single window in each room was small and positioned too high to provide much natural light. How many people share each room? Henry asked, his voice tight with something that might have been shame. 2 or 3, depending on their position in the household, Eliza replied quietly. The kitchen maids share, as do the housemaids. The senior staff have rooms to themselves. Henry thought of his own spacious bedroom suite, with its sitting area, dressing room and private bath, and felt sick. "This is unacceptable," he said firmly. "No one should have to live in such conditions." "Your Grace, these accommodations are quite standard for UP." "I don't care what's standard," Henry interrupted. "I care what's right. We're going to make changes, Eliza. Significant changes." Over the following days, as Henry's strength continued to return, he threw himself into learning about every aspect of his estate's operations. He met with his steward, a competent but unimaginative man named Mr. Thornbury, and began asking questions that clearly made the man uncomfortable. "The tenant farmers' cottages," Henry said, reviewing the estate ledgers in his study. "When were they last improved?" "I believe some repairs were made." "Oh, perhaps 8 years ago, Your Grace," Thornbury replied, consulting his records. "Minor improvements to the roofing and such, and 8 years, Henry repeated. "And the wages for the household staff?" "May have remained steady for the past 5 years, Your Grace. Very reasonable rates, well within the standard range for keeping people in poverty while I live in luxury," Henry finished grimly. "Mr. Thornbury, I want you to prepare a comprehensive report on the living conditions of every person who works on this estate. I want to know about their housing, their wages, their families, their needs. And I want it within the week." Thornbury's eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline. "Your Grace, such an undertaking would be quite extensive. Perhaps if you could tell me what specific concerns—" "My concern is that I've been a negligent landlord and employer," Henry said bluntly, "and I intend to remedy that situation immediately." Word of the Duke's unusual interest in his servants' welfare spread quickly through the household, generating a mixture of hope, confusion, and suspicion. Some of the staff who had fled during his illness began to return, drawn by rumors of improved conditions and increased wages. Others remained skeptical, certain that this new concern for their welfare would prove to be a temporary whim that would fade once His Grace fully recovered. Eliza found herself in an increasingly awkward position. During Henry's illness, she had been his primary caregiver, sharing intimate conversations and developing a relationship that transcended the usual boundaries between master and servant. Now, as the household returned to normal operations, she was expected to resume her former role as an invisible housemaid, while Henry reassumed his position as the distant, aristocratic Duke. "You've been avoiding me," Henry observed one afternoon when he encountered Eliza in the library, where she was dusting the countless volumes he had never bothered to read. "Not avoiding, Your Grace," Eliza replied carefully, not meeting his eyes. "Simply returning to my proper duties now that you're well." "Your proper duties," Henry repeated, his voice carrying a note of frustration. "And what if I don't want you to return to being invisible? What if I value your counsel and your company?" Eliza finally looked at him, her brown eyes troubled. "Your Grace, what happened during your illness was extraordinary circumstances, but you're a duke and I'm a maid. The world hasn't changed just because you've recovered. Soon, hasn't it?" Henry asked, moving closer to where she stood among the towering bookshelves. "And I've changed, Eliza, fundamentally and irrevocably. I can't go back to being the man I was before, the man who never saw you, who never appreciated your worth, who accepted loyalty without offering anything in return." "What are you saying?" Eliza whispered. "I'm saying that I don't want to lose what we found together during those weeks. I'm saying that you've become important to me in ways I'm still trying to understand. I'm saying that I care about you, Eliza Bennet, and I want you in my life in a capacity that goes far beyond your duties as a housemaid." Eliza stared at him, her heart racing with a mixture of hope and terror. "Henry, you can't mean— that is, the difference in our stations—" "It means nothing to me," Henry said firmly. "I've learned that worth isn't determined by birth or wealth, but by character and compassion. And by those measures, you are the most valuable person I've ever known." "Oh, but society— "Oh, it can go to hell," Henry said with surprising vehemence. "I've spent my entire life living according to society's expectations, and where did it get me? Alone and abandoned when I needed help most, surrounded by people who saw me as nothing more than a source of wealth and status. You're the only person who has ever cared for me without wanting something in return, and I'll be damned if I let social conventions keep us apart." Eliza felt tears streaming down her face as she struggled to process what he was saying. "Henry, even if you mean what you're saying now, you'll change your mind when you're fully recovered. When you remember who you are and what your position requires, I know exactly who I am," Henry interrupted, reaching out to gently cup her face in his hands. I'm a man who was dying alone until an angel disguised as a housemaid saved his life. I'm a man who has learned the difference between being served and being loved. I'm a man who wants to spend the rest of his life proving himself worthy of the extraordinary woman who showed him what true devotion looks like. You're talking about marriage, Eliza breathed, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. I'm talking about love, Henry replied. Marriage is just the legal recognition of what I already feel in my heart. Eliza, I love you. I love your strength, your compassion, your unwavering moral compass. I love the way you see the best in people, the way you care for others without thought of reward, the way you made me want to be a better man. I love you too, Eliza whispered, the admission seeming to surprise her as much as it did him. I think I started falling in love with you during those first terrible nights, when you were so vulnerable and afraid. I saw past the title and the wealth to the man underneath, and that man is extraordinary. Henry's smile was radiant as he leaned down to kiss her, a gentle, reverent kiss that spoke of love and gratitude and the promise of a future neither of them had dared to imagine. When they broke apart, Eliza rested her forehead against his, her eyes bright with tears of joy and wonder. What happens now? She asked softly. Now. Oh, Henry said, his voice warm with love and determination. We prove that true love can overcome any obstacle, including the prejudices of a society that values appearances over substance. Now we show the world that a duke and a maid can find happiness together because they see each other's true worth. It won't be easy, Eliza warned. People will say terrible things about both of us. They'll say I'm a fortune hunter, that you've lost your mind, that our marriage is a scandal that will ruin your reputation. Let them say what they will, Henry replied. I've learned that the opinions of people who abandoned me in my hour of need are worth less than nothing. The only opinion that matters to me is yours, and if you'll have me, I'd like to spend the rest of my life earning your love and respect. You already have both, Eliza said, her voice thick with emotion. You've had them since the moment you thanked me for staying when everyone else left. As they stood together in the library, surrounded by books that contained the wisdom of ages, Henry and Eliza began to plan a future that would challenge every convention of their time. It would not be an easy path, but it would be one they walked together, supported by a love that had been forged in the crucible of suffering and tested by the fires of adversity. For the first time in his life, Henry Whitford felt truly wealthy, not in money or property, but in the love of a woman who had seen him at his worst and chosen to stay. And for Eliza Bennet, who had spent her life believing she was destined for invisibility and servitude, the future suddenly blazed with possibilities she had never dared to dream. Love, they had discovered, was indeed the greatest equalizer of all. Facing the storm, the announcement of Duke Henry Whitford's engagement to Miss Eliza Bennet sent shockwaves through London society that reverberated from the grandest drawing rooms of Mayfair to the humblest servants' halls throughout England. The news, which Henry had insisted be published in the London papers, despite his steward's horrified protests, was met with reactions ranging from stunned disbelief to outright scandal. "Have you completely taken leave of your senses?" Charles Whitford demanded, as he stormed into Henry's study 3 days after the announcement appeared in print. Henry's younger brother had returned from London the moment he heard the news, his face flushed with anger and what looked suspiciously like panic. "Good morning to you too, Charles," Henry replied calmly, not looking up from the correspondence he was reviewing. "I trust your journey from London was pleasant. Don't you dare take that tone with me," Charles snapped. "Do you have any idea what you've done? The entire town is talking about nothing else. They're saying you've lost your mind, that the fever damaged your brain, that you're being manipulated by a scheming servant girl who saw an opportunity to elevate herself." Henry set down his pen and fixed his brother with a steady gaze. "And what do you say, Charles?" I say you're making the biggest mistake of your life," Charles replied without hesitation. "Henry, this woman is a housemaid, a servant. You cannot possibly marry her without destroying everything our family has built over centuries." "And everything our family has built," Henry repeated thoughtfully. "But you mean our reputation, our standing in society, our ability to move in the highest circles?" "Yes, exactly. You're the Duke of Whitford, for God's sake. You have responsibilities, obligations. I have one obligation," Henry interrupted, rising from his chair with the authority that made Charles step back. "To live with honor and integrity." and I can think of no more honorable course than marrying the woman who saved my life when my own family abandoned me to die." Charles's face flushed an even deeper red. "That's not fair. We left because the physician said, it might be contagious," Henry finished. "They didn't order you to flee. They didn't force you to pack your belongings and retreat to London while I fought for my life. You chose to leave, Charles, just as Margaret chose to leave. But Eliza chose to stay. She's a servant. It was her duty to stay." "No," Henry said quietly. "It was her choice. And it's a choice that revealed more about her character than anything you or Margaret have ever done has revealed about yours." The confrontation with Charles was only the beginning. Over the following days, Henry found himself besieged by visitors, all of whom seemed determined to talk him out of what they viewed as a catastrophic error in judgment. Margaret arrived from London with her husband, both of them wearing expressions of barely concealed horror as they pleaded with Henry to reconsider. "Think of your children," Margaret urged during a particularly tense conversation in the drawing room. "How will they be received in society with a mother who was once a housemaid? How will they make suitable marriages when their parentage is considered scandalous?" "As I think," Henry replied evenly, "is that any children Eliza and I might have will be raised to value character over convention, kindness over status, and love over social advantage. They will be better people for having her as their mother." "And you're being naive," Margaret's husband interjected. "Society doesn't change its opinions simply because you wish it to. Your children will suffer for this decision. My children will learn that their father chose love over fear, principle over prejudice. If that causes them to suffer some social inconvenience, I believe they'll survive it." The local gentry were equally appalled. Lord and Lady Pemberton called to express their malgré concern for Henry's welfare and to suggest that perhaps he was not yet fully recovered from his illness. "We're simply worried about you, Henry," Lady Pemberton said with false sweetness. "This engagement is so unexpected, so unlike you. Are you certain you're thinking clearly?" "Yeah, I'm thinking more clearly than I ever have in my life," Henry replied. "For the first time, I'm making decisions based on what I know to be right, rather than what others expect of me." "But surely you must see how impossible this is," Lord Pemberton added. "The girl has no education, no breeding, no understanding of what it means to be a duchess. She'll be a laughingstock, and by extension, so will you. Still, Eliza has more natural grace and dignity than most women who were born to the role," Henry said firmly. "She has intelligence, compassion, and strength of character. Those are the qualities that matter in a duchess, not the circumstances of her birth." Throughout all of these confrontations, Eliza remained largely hidden from view, continuing her duties as a housemaid while the storm of controversy raged around them. Henry could see the strain the situation was placing on her, the way she flinched when she overheard the cruel comments of visitors, the doubt that crept into her eyes when faced with the unanimous disapproval of his social circle. "Perhaps they're right," she said one evening as they walked together in the garden behind the manor house, away from the prying eyes and judgmental stares of the household. "Perhaps this is madness. Perhaps I should release you from your engagement before you destroy your life for my sake." Henry stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious. "Eliza, look at me. Do you love me?" "And you know I do," she replied, tears threatening to spill from her eyes. "Do you believe that I love you?" "And yes, but then nothing else matters. Not their disapproval, not their predictions of social ruin, not their certainty that we're making a mistake. What matters is that we found something rare and precious, a love based on genuine understanding and mutual respect. I won't let the prejudices of small-minded people destroy that." "But Henry, what if they're right about the children? What if our marriage does make life difficult for them?" Henry took her hands in his touch warm and reassuring. "Eliza, my darling, every generation faces the choice between perpetuating the prejudices of the past or working to create a better future. I want our children to grow up in a world where worth is measured by character rather than birth, where love is valued over social advantage. Someone has to be willing to take the first step toward that world, and I can think of no better way to do it than by marrying the most extraordinary woman I've ever known." "You really believe we can overcome all of this?" Eliza asked, her voice small but hopeful. "I believe that love can overcome anything," Henry replied with conviction. "And I believe that you and I together are stronger than any obstacle society can place in our path." As if to test that belief, the next morning brought the arrival of Henry's great-aunt, the formidable Dowager Countess of Ashworth, a woman whose opinion carried significant weight in the highest circles of society. Lady Ashworth was 75 years old, sharp as a blade, and utterly uncompromising in her views about proper behavior and social order. "Henry," she said without preamble, as she swept into his study like an avenging angel, "but I have come to talk sense into you before you complete this act of social suicide." "At Aunt Beatrice," Henry replied, rising to greet her with a bow that was respectful but not subservient. "How lovely to see you. I trust your journey from London was comfortable." Don't you dare try to charm me, young man," Lady Ashworth snapped, settling into a chair with the air of a general preparing for battle. "I am here because your mother, God rest her soul, was my dearest friend, and I will not stand by and watch you destroy everything she held dear." "Yes. And what did my mother hold dear, Aunt?" Henry asked, genuinely curious about her answer. "Her honor, dignity, the preservation of our family's good name, none of which will survive your marriage to a housemaid." Henry was quiet for a moment, considering his response. "Aunt Beatrice, may I tell you about the night I nearly died?" "I fail to see how that's relevant." Please," Henry said quietly. Indulge me." Lady Ashworth pressed her lips together, but nodded for him to continue. "I was burning with fever, delirious, convinced that I was going to die alone and forgotten. My brother had fled to London. My sister had retreated to her own home. The servants had abandoned their posts. I lay in that bed, surrounded by all the wealth and privilege our family had accumulated over generations, and none of it could buy me a single moment of human compassion." Henry paused, his voice growing softer. "And then I became aware of someone moving quietly through my room, someone who brought me water when my throat was parched, who placed cool cloths on my burning forehead, who sat beside my bed through the long, dark hours and reminded me that I was not alone. That someone was Eliza Bennet, a woman who owed me nothing, who had every reason to flee like the others, but who chose to stay because she believed it was right." Lady Ashworth's expression had grown thoughtful, but she remained silent. "For 3 weeks, Aunt, she risked her own life to care for mine. Not because she hoped for reward, not because she saw an opportunity for advancement, but because she possesses the kind of moral courage that our so-called betters seem to have forgotten entirely. She saved my life, and in doing so, she showed me what true nobility looks like." "That's a very touching story," Lady Ashworth said finally. "Rob, but gratitude is not a sufficient foundation for marriage." "You're right," Henry agreed. "Gratitude isn't enough, but love is. And I love Eliza Bennet with all my heart, not because she saved my life, but because of who she is. She is kind, intelligent, principled, and strong. She sees the best in people and brings out the best in them. She has made me a better man, and she will make me a better duke." Lady Ashworth studied him for a long moment, her sharp eyes searching his face for any sign of doubt or uncertainty. "You're absolutely determined to go through with this?" "Absolutely," Henry replied without hesitation. "Even knowing that it will cost you the respect of your peers, the acceptance of society, the easy life you've always known." Even knowing all of that." Lady Ashworth was quiet for several minutes, her gaze distant as she appeared to wrestle with some internal debate. Finally she spoke. "Very well. If you're determined to marry this girl, then we must ensure that she's prepared for what lies ahead. She'll need proper training in deportment, education in the social graces, instruction in the duties and expectations of a duchess. I assume she can read and write?" Henry blinked in surprise at this unexpected turn. Yes, she's quite well educated, actually. She reads voraciously and has a natural intelligence that do good. That will make things easier. I'll arrange for suitable tutors to come from London. We'll need to work on her speech, her posture, her understanding of social protocols. If she's going to be a duchess, she must be above reproach in every way that matters. Or Aunt Beatrice, are you saying? "Now I'm saying that if you're going to scandalize society, you might as well do it properly," Lady Ashworth replied, with something that might have been a smile. "Your mother always said that love was the most important thing in a marriage, though she was never given the chance to marry for love herself. Perhaps it's time someone in this family had the courage to follow their heart instead of their obligations." Henry felt a surge of gratitude and relief, so powerful it nearly brought him to his knees. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Your support means more than you know." Don't thank me yet," Lady Ashworth warned. "The road ahead will be difficult. and there will be many who never accept your choice. But if this girl truly possesses the qualities you claim she does, then perhaps she'll prove them all wrong." As Lady Ashworth departed to begin arrangements for Eliza's education and preparation, Henry felt a renewed sense of hope. The storm of disapproval would continue to rage around them, but they would not face it alone. Love, he was learning, had a way of creating its own allies, its own sources of strength, and with Eliza by his side, he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The transformation. Under Lady Ashworth's exacting supervision, Eliza's transformation from housemaid to duchess in training began with an intensity that left her breathless. The elderly countess had taken up residence at Whitford Manor, bringing with her a small army of tutors, seamstresses and instructors whose sole purpose was to prepare Eliza for her future role. "Posture, Miss Bennet," commanded Madame Rousseau, the French deportment instructor Lady Ashworth had summoned from London. "A duchess does not slouch. Imagine a string pulling you upward from the crown of your head. Shoulders back, chin up, but not so high as to appear arrogant." Eliza adjusted her stance for the 100th time that morning, trying to find the delicate balance between confidence and humility that seemed to be required of her new station. The lessons were exhausting. Hours spent learning to walk with books balanced on her head, to curtsy with perfect grace, to enter and exit a room with the kind of presence that commanded respect without appearing presumptuous. "And better," Madame Rousseau acknowledged with grudging approval. "But you must practice until it becomes natural. A duchess who appears to be concentrating on her deportment is a duchess who reveals her humble origins." The comment stung, as it was meant to, but Eliza had learned to endure such subtle cruelties with the same grace she had once used to bear the casual dismissals of her former position. She was no longer invisible, but she was not yet accepted either. She existed in a strange liminal space between servant and lady, neither one thing nor the other. "Don't let Rousseau's sharp tongue discourage you," Lady Ashworth said later, as they took tea in the morning room. "She's deliberately harsh because she wants to prepare you for worse treatment from society. Better to develop thick skin now than to be wounded by every slight you'll encounter as Henry's wife." "Is it always going to be this difficult?" Eliza asked, setting down her teacup with hands that trembled slightly from exhaustion. "Will I ever truly belong in Henry's world, or will I always be the housemaid who married above her station?" Lady Ashworth studied her with those sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to see everything. "That depends entirely on you, my dear. Society will judge you harshly at first, that's inevitable. But if you conduct yourself with dignity, intelligence and grace, if you prove yourself worthy of the position through your actions rather than your words, then eventually even the most stubborn critics will be forced to acknowledge your worth. And if I fail, if I embarrass Henry or prove unequal to the role, then you'll confirm every prejudice they hold about the unsuitability of marrying beneath one's station," Lady Ashworth replied with characteristic bluntness. "Which is why failure is not an option. You must be better than perfect, my dear. You must be extraordinary." And the pressure was immense, but Eliza found strength in her daily conversations with Henry, who made time each evening to walk with her in the garden and listen to her struggles with the day's lessons. "And Madame Rousseau says, I'll never lose my common accent entirely," Eliza confided one evening as they strolled among the roses that had begun to bloom despite the approaching winter. "She says the best I can hope for is to minimize it enough that people won't immediately identify my origins. Tell me your accent is part of who you are." Henry replied firmly, "I don't want you to lose it entirely. It reminds me of your authenticity, your connection to the real world that I was so isolated from." "But Henry, if it marks me as common, and then it marks you as honest," Henry interrupted. "Eliza, I fell in love with you exactly as you are. I don't want you to become someone else in order to please people whose opinions I don't value. I want you to become the best version of yourself." "Who? Lady Ashworth says I must be extraordinary," Eliza said with a sigh. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm capable of that." Henry stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious in the moonlight. "Eliza, you've already proven you're extraordinary. You showed extraordinary courage when you stayed to care for me while everyone else fled. You demonstrated extraordinary compassion when you risked your own life for someone who had never even bothered to learn your name. You displayed extraordinary strength when you endured weeks of exhausting care without complaint or expectation of reward." "That was different," Eliza protested. "That was just doing what was right." "Exactly," Henry said, taking her hands in his. "And that's what makes you extraordinary. You don't even recognize your own remarkable qualities because they come so naturally to you. Most people have to work to be kind, to be selfless, to be brave. For you, it's simply who you are. As the weeks passed, Eliza began to find her footing in her new role. The lessons with Madame Rousseau became less torturous as her posture improved and her movements gained the fluid grace expected of a duchess. Her sessions with Mr. Pembroke, the classics tutor Lady Ashworth had engaged, opened up new worlds of literature and philosophy that fed her hungry mind. "You have a natural aptitude for languages," Mr. Pembroke observed during one of their French lessons. "With your intelligence and dedication, you could become quite accomplished in several tongues." "Would that be appropriate for someone of my background?" Eliza asked hesitantly. "My dear Miss Bennet," Mr. Pembroke replied with a smile, "accomplishment is always appropriate. The more educated and cultured you become, the more difficult it will be for anyone to question your fitness for your future position." Perhaps the most challenging lessons came from Mrs. Hartwell, the housekeeper who had served the Whitford family for 15 years and who now found herself in the awkward position of instructing her former subordinate in the management of a ducal household. "The mistress of a great house must know every aspect of its operation," Mrs. Hartwell explained, as they toured the kitchens, pantries and storage areas that Eliza had once cleaned but never truly understood. "You must be able to plan menus for everything from intimate family dinners to grand entertainments for 50 guests. You must understand the hierarchy of servants, the proper allocation of duties, the management of household accounts." "It seems overwhelming," Eliza admitted as they reviewed the complex schedules that govern the daily life of the manor. "It is overwhelming at first," Mrs. Hartwell agreed. "But you have advantages that many ladies of breeding lack. You understand the work from the servant's perspective. You know what motivates them, what challenges they face, what improvements would make their lives easier. That knowledge will make you a better mistress than someone who has never seen beyond the drawing room." The comment was perhaps the first truly encouraging thing Mrs. Hartwell had said since the lessons began, and it gave Eliza hope that she might indeed be capable of fulfilling her future role. As autumn deepened into winter, the wedding preparations began in earnest. Lady Ashworth had decreed that the ceremony would take place at the village church rather than in London, partly to avoid the worst of the social scandal and partly to emphasize Henry's connection to his estate and tenants. "Let them see that you're not ashamed of your choice," she advised Henry during one of their planning sessions. "Let them see that you're proud to claim Eliza as your bride before the very people she once served. It will go a long way toward establishing her legitimacy in their eyes." The guest list was a careful balance of family obligations and strategic inclusions. Charles and Margaret would attend, of course, though their disapproval remained palpable. Several of Henry's closest friends had agreed to come, some out of loyalty and others out of curiosity. A selection of local gentry had been invited, along with representatives from the tenant farming families and the household staff. "It will be unlike any wedding our circles have ever seen," Lady Ashworth observed with what might have been satisfaction. "But perhaps that's exactly what's needed. Perhaps it's time to shake up the established order." The most significant challenge came in the form of Eliza's wedding dress. The local seamstresses were skilled but had never created a gown suitable for a duchess, while the fashionable London modistes were reluctant to associate themselves with what they viewed as a scandalous match. "We'll design it ourselves," Lady Ashworth declared, after the third London establishment declined their commission. "I have some skill with fashion, and we can engage local craftswomen to execute our vision. It will be more meaningful anyway, a dress created specifically for you, rather than adapted from someone else's design." The resulting gown was a masterpiece of understated elegance. Made from ivory silk with delicate pearl embroidery, it was designed to complement Eliza's natural beauty rather than overwhelm it. The style was fashionable, but not ostentatious, appropriate for a duchess, but not so grand as to seem presumptuous. "You look beautiful," Henry said when he saw her in the completed dress during a final fitting. "Like a queen, but an approachable queen. Someone people will want to serve out of love rather than fear." As the wedding day approached, Eliza found herself surprisingly calm. The months of preparation had given her confidence in her ability to fulfill her new role, while Henry's unwavering support had convinced her that their love could indeed overcome the obstacles they faced. "Are you nervous?" Lady Ashworth asked on the morning of the ceremony as she helped Eliza with her final preparations. "Strangely, no," Eliza replied, studying her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the humble housemaid who had once moved invisibly through these same rooms. This woman stood tall and confident, her bearing dignified, her expression serene. "I think I'm ready." "I believe you are," Lady Ashworth agreed. "You've worked harder than any pupil I've ever known, and you've exceeded every expectation. Henry is fortunate to have found you." The ceremony itself was a revelation. The small village church was packed with an unlikely congregation, dukes and farmers, servants and gentry, all gathered to witness a union that challenged every convention of their time. As Eliza walked down the aisle on the arm of Mr. Thornbury, the estate steward who had agreed to give her away in the absence of any family, she felt the weight of history in the moment. Henry waited at the altar, resplendent in his formal attire but with eyes only for her. When their gazes met, his smile was so radiant that it seemed to light up the entire church. "Dearly beloved," the vicar began, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed sanctuary, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Henry James Whitford, Duke of Whitford, and Eliza Mary Bennet in holy matrimony." The words that followed were traditional, but their meaning was revolutionary. As Henry and Eliza exchanged vows, promising to love, honor, and cherish each other, regardless of the challenges that lay ahead, they were not just joining their lives together. They were making a statement about the power of love to transcend social barriers. "You may kiss the bride," the vicar announced. And when Henry lifted Eliza's veil and pressed his lips to hers, the church erupted in applause that was both celebratory and defiant. As they walked back down the aisle as husband and wife, Eliza caught sight of faces in the congregation, some approving, some skeptical, some openly hostile. But she also saw tears of joy on the faces of the household staff who had watched her transformation, pride in the eyes of the tenant farmers who had always known her kindness, and satisfaction on Lady Ashworth's face as she witnessed the success of her protégé. The reception at Whitford Manor was unlike any social gathering the estate had ever hosted. Dukes danced with dairymaids, countesses shared tables with kitchen staff, and the rigid hierarchies that usually governed such events were temporarily suspended in celebration of a love that had already proven its power to break down barriers. "You've done something remarkable here," observed Lord Pemberton as he approached Henry during the festivities. "I'll admit, I had my doubts about your choice, but seeing Eliza tonight, she carries herself like she was born to be a duchess." "She was born to be extraordinary," Henry replied, watching his new wife as she moved gracefully through the crowd, speaking with equal warmth to every guest regardless of their station. "I was just fortunate enough to recognize it." As the evening drew to a close and the last guests departed, Henry and Eliza found themselves alone in the garden where they had shared so many conversations during her transformation from maid to duchess. "How do you feel, Your Grace?" Henry asked, using her new title with a mixture of pride and affection. "Like I'm exactly where I belong," Eliza replied, her voice full of wonder at the truth of the statement. "For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm exactly who I'm meant to be." "And who is that?" "Your wife," Eliza said simply. "Your partner, your equal. Someone who can stand beside you and help you be the best duke you can be, while you help me be the best duchess I can be." As they stood together under the stars, surrounded by the roses that had witnessed their courtship and the gardens that had been the setting for so many of their most important conversations, Henry and Eliza knew that they had achieved something remarkable. They had proven that love could indeed conquer all, not by ignoring the obstacles in their path, but by facing them together with courage, determination, and an unwavering belief in each other's worth. The Duke and his Duchess had found their happily ever after, but more than that, they had blazed a trail for others who dared to believe that true love was more powerful than social convention, that character mattered more than birth, and that the human heart could triumph over even the most entrenched prejudices. Their love story would be remembered not just as a romance, but as a revolution, a quiet but profound challenge to a world that valued appearances over substance, wealth over worth, and tradition over truth. And in the years to come, as they worked together to improve the lives of their tenants, to reform the conditions of their servants, and to raise children who understood that nobility came from actions rather than bloodlines, they would prove that their love had indeed changed the world, one heart at a time. The legacy 10 years later. The nursery at Whitford Manor echoed with the delighted laughter of children as 5-year-old James Henry Whitford chased his 3-year-old sister Catherine around the rocking horse that had been a gift from their great-aunt Beatrice. Eliza, now the Duchess of Whitford in both name and bearing, watched from the doorway with a smile that held all the contentment of a woman who had found her perfect place in the world. "They have your energy," Henry observed, joining her at the threshold of their children's domain. At 42, he had grown even more handsome with age, the lines around his eyes speaking of laughter shared and challenges overcome together. "And your stubbornness," Eliza replied, laughing as young James insisted on helping his sister reach a toy that was clearly beyond her grasp. "Did you see how he refused to let the nursemaid assist Catherine? He's determined to be her protector." "He learned that from watching me with you," Henry said, slipping his arm around his wife's waist. "The importance of taking care of the people you love." The years had been kind to them both. Eliza had grown into her role as Duchess with a grace and capability that had gradually won over even their harshest critics. She had become known throughout the county for her charitable works, her improvements to the estate's schools and hospitals, and her innovative approaches to tenant welfare that other landowners had begun to emulate. "The letter from the Children's Foundation arrived this morning," Eliza said, pulling an envelope from her pocket. "The school we funded in Manchester has exceeded all expectations. They're requesting support for 2 additional locations." "Of course," Henry replied without hesitation. "Education is the great equalizer, isn't it? Every child deserves the chance to rise as far as their talents and determination can take them." It was a philosophy they had put into practice not just in their charitable endeavors, but in their own household. The servants at Whitford Manor were the best paid and best treated in the county, their children educated alongside the tenant farmers' offspring in schools that Eliza had established and Henry had funded. Several former housemaids had been promoted to positions of responsibility, while others had been helped to establish themselves in trades or professions that matched their abilities. "Your Grace," said Mrs. Patterson, the woman who had succeeded Mrs. Hartwell as housekeeper when the latter retired to a comfortable cottage on the estate. "Lord and Lady Pemberton have arrived for tea." "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. We'll be down shortly." As they made their way to the drawing room, Eliza reflected on how much had changed since their wedding day. The Pembertons, who had once been among their most vocal critics, had become close friends and allies. Lady Pemberton, in particular, had become one of Eliza's strongest supporters in her charitable work. "Eliza, my dear," Lady Pemberton said, rising to embrace the Duchess as they entered the drawing room, "you look radiant as always. And Henry, you appear to be thriving. Marriage clearly agrees with you both." "Indeed it does," Lord Pemberton agreed, accepting a cup of tea from Eliza with genuine warmth. "We've just come from London, and I must tell you, your reputation there continues to grow. The Queen herself mentioned your work with the children's schools during our audience last week." "Her Majesty is very kind," Eliza replied modestly, though Henry could see the pleasure the compliment brought her. "Kind, perhaps, but also accurate," Lady Pemberton added. "You've become quite the model for other ladies of rank, you know. There's talk of establishing a formal organization to coordinate charitable efforts among the nobility, with you as one of the founding members." As their guests departed that evening, Henry and Eliza walked through the gardens that had been the setting for so many of their most important conversations. The roses were in full bloom, their fragrance perfuming the warm summer air, while the sound of their children's laughter drifted from the nursery windows above. "Do you ever regret it?" Eliza asked, a question she had not posed in years, but which sometimes still surfaced during moments of quiet reflection. "The scandal, the social upheaval, the challenges we faced in those early years." Henry stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious but warm. "Eliza, my love, marrying you was the best decision I ever made. Not just because I love you, though I do, more deeply with each passing year, but because you made me a better man, a better duke, a better human being." "You did the same for me," Eliza replied softly. "You saw worth in me when I couldn't see it in myself. You gave me the courage to become more than I ever dreamed possible." "We saved each other," Henry said, taking her hands in his. "You saved my life when I was dying, and I like to think I saved your dreams when society would have kept you invisible forever." As they stood together in the garden, surrounded by the beauty they had created and the love they had nurtured, both Henry and Eliza knew that their story had become something larger than themselves. They had proven that love could indeed conquer all, that worth was not determined by birth but by character, and that two people committed to each other and to doing good in the world could create ripples of change that extended far beyond their own lives. Their children would grow up understanding that nobility was earned through actions rather than inherited through bloodlines. The servants in their household would know that their contributions were valued and their potential recognized. The tenants on their estate would benefit from innovations in education, healthcare, and working conditions that other landowners would eventually adopt. And somewhere in England, in a great house where a duke lay dying while his family fled in fear, a humble maid would remember the story of Eliza Bennet and find the courage to stay, to care, to love without expectation of reward. The cycle would continue, one act of compassion inspiring another, one love story proving that the next was possible. For Henry and Eliza Whitford, Duke and Duchess of Whitford, had discovered the most important truth of all, that love, when it is genuine and selfless and brave enough to challenge the world's prejudices, has the power to transform not just two hearts, but an entire society. Their legacy would live on in the lives they had touched, the barriers they had broken, and the example they had set for all who dared to believe that true love could indeed conquer all. Their love story became a beacon of hope that illuminated the truth that genuine worth comes not from the circumstances of one's birth, but from the content of one's character. Duke Henry Whitford and Duchess Eliza proved that when love is rooted in mutual respect, shared values, and unwavering commitment to each other's growth, it can overcome any obstacle society places in its path. Their union showed the world that the greatest nobility lies not in ancient bloodlines or vast fortunes, but in the courage to see beyond surface appearances to the extraordinary potential that exists within every human heart. In choosing love over convention, compassion over prejudice, and character over class, they created a legacy that would inspire generations to come. A reminder that true love, when it is brave enough to challenge the status quo, has the power to change the world one heart at a time.